Strategy is fundamentally about choices. Choices can be overwhelming. We've got volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, what people sometimes refer to as VUCA. And there's so many other factors that can be part of making a decision. Thankfully, there are useful tools that can help you make informed choices. And those are choices that can align with your values, that can support your long-term goals, that can lean into your competitive advantage. So in today's episode, we'll walk you through one of those key tools that's one of our favorites here at Work Wisdom, the strategy screen. Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Mike McKenna. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift towards joy and meaningful achievement. Today, we're turning our focus to the strategy screen. We want you to understand what this decision-making tool is and how to use it within your organization and maybe even in your personal life. And we're grateful to have my friend Clarke Madden here with us. Clarke is the first Deputy State Inspector General at the Office of the State Inspector General, and he is a seasoned leader in public service. Prior to his appointment, he was the Executive Deputy Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services, and in that role, he helped lead Pennsylvania's response for vulnerable seniors during the pandemic. He's also been a Chief of Staff for OSIG, Deputy Attorney General in the Office of the Attorney General, and he's practiced law as a civil and criminal litigator. So, Clarke, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I'd say with all of those impressive titles that you've held, you have to understand strategy inwards, outwards, backwards, forwards, right?
Well, I'm certainly an avowed fan of strategy and strategic tools, and so it's certainly very important to try and organize thinking around strategic decisions. So I'm excited to talk to you today about the strategy screen and how folks can use that to bring some order and discipline to their own strategic decision making.
Yeah, that discipline piece is key. So let's start right at the basics.
Sure.
What is the strategy screen?
Okay, so there are a couple of things where we're thinking about a strategy screen. So like anything else, it's a tool. And the way I think of it is as an organizing principle for thinking and decision making. I took a little bit of an unconventional path into organizational leadership. I went to a great school called St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, which was the Great Books program.
Yes, of course.
And so we studied philosophy, among other things. So that's sort of affected my thinking since I was younger about how to approach organizational problems. So if you'll indulge me, it reminds me a little bit of Kant. So if there is an award on The Behaviorist for bringing up Kant, I'm pleased to compete. Pleased to compete for it. But the simple idea is this. So we want to use the strategy screen as a kind of a schema. Now, what's that? Well, a schema is a framework for understanding. So if we think a little bit about how we think about things in general, we know, right, that we don't really see with our eyes, we see with our mind, right? So when you're looking at something, the processing isn't happening in your eyes, it's happening in your mind. And so I think Kant sort of took that a step further and said, okay, well, really your mind isn't processing the data it's receiving directly to see, for example, this handsome brass owl that you have here on the table in the studio, but rather I have an idea of owlness that I am applying to that information, right? That sort of lets me recognize it and see it and understand it. So the strategy screen is a similar thing. At its most basic, it's a list of questions that are important to you and your organization that you apply to each important decision you make. Now, what goes into the questions, and I look forward to talking with you about that, is up to you. And there are some key, I think, elements that we'll want to discuss later. But the concept is that you're going to take this list of questions and build a discipline, a habit of thought of applying it to each important decision that you need to make for your organization. And in that sense, it will operate like a schema, right? So that you're not just dumping, and that's really easy to do. I've done it myself. You're not just dumping the data that you find relevant to a given decision into, for example, an agendaless meeting, which I have been, on both sides of in leadership, right? And then you're forced to kind of hack it out and arrive at a decision that maybe didn't bring everything in that you wanted to bring in, or maybe was made in a different way than you have made other decisions. So to me, that's the key, is it brings that consistency. If you build the list of questions, we'll talk about that, and apply that screen, that filter to each decision you want to make, then you're using it like that schema. So you have that, substitute your own strategic vision for sort of the concept of owlness, right? And then hopefully it spits out something that's usable and consistent. So I think that's it at a high level.
Yeah. And it helps to reinforce, right, that notion that you're saying of having a habit of mind, having some discipline around it.
Exactly.
The more that your organization can use it, the closer you can get to that notion of achieving what you outlined in your strategy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Ultimate success for yourself or your organization.
That's
right.
So
what are some of those key elements? If we think about, anybody could come up with a series of filter questions, but how we're framing those questions is so important to what we want to achieve on the other end of that. So
absolutely. So I think first let's talk about underlying assumptions. So we're going to presume for our discussion that your organization has thought a little bit already about things like values and strategic objectives, so that you have a little bit of a sense already of your organizational identity. That's really important to picking the questions, right? So to me, it's a mixture of what I would call almost philosophical questions about what your organization is, what it wants to be, and what kind of things it does and wants to do. And then the more practical questions like, can you afford it?
Right.
Do you have the personnel to staff it? Does it help your staff? Does it help your customers? And some of these can seem very obvious, but the thing I really like about the strategy screen, as we've already hit on, is it builds that discipline of pulling all those same factors into each decision. So I think if you're looking for what's the literal first step I could take to start to use this tool, then I would sit down as an organizational leader and think about, okay, what are the mission critical things that we need to bring to each decision? If, for example, we're thinking about opening a new location, then there are financial and personnel considerations that we need to think about. We need to think about all of the traditional things in terms of analyzing the market in that area and looking at our own financials and thinking about how that fits into our longer term vision. But then I think the thing that's really neat about the tool is that then you can also build the habit of bringing in things like, well, okay, but does opening that new location advance our values in a meaningful way? All the things that aren't kind of the quantitative considerations that go into making a decision, but the more sort of qualitative ones that go to the identity of your organization. So I think that to me is how to start, is think, let's come up with 5, let's say, for the sake of argument, questions that go to organizational identity, and 5 that go to more traditional considerations like budget and personnel and other hidden costs of something you think about doing.
Yeah, I think that's a good number. If we keep it sort of in that no more than 10, it is something that we can use with a lot of fidelity, a lot of consistency. It doesn't feel too onerous, but it's covering enough that we're making sure these decisions are really considering the most important factors.
That's right. And I think, too, that you want to think about how to set it up. So how do you take this list of questions and then turn it into a useful tool, into I think, you've talked about it as a Swiss Army knife, and I like that. So you've got to, figure out when you're going to pull out the toothpick and when you're going to use the scissors and so on. So I think if you can, let's again try and think of practical, easy tools, right, to reduce the friction of bringing it into your own practice. So you can just use a table, use a word table, and put your questions, those thoughts, into a column of the table. But then one thing that I have discovered that has helped me a lot and in employing it is literally write down the different options that you are considering on the same table each time that you use it, so that you avoid what I think of as perfunctory use of the list, right? Once you've built it, it's very easy to fall, I think, into a trap, which I've done myself, of thinking, well, now I understand them, and I'm going to bring them almost sort of unconsciously to...
By osmosis.
Exactly, right? So I'm not going through that discipline, that sort of kata of using them each for each decision. So that's my 2 cents is, put it in a table, but then if you're, let's keep the new location example, put as much relevant detail into it as you can about that location and whatever other options there would be. For example, not doing anything or considering still another location. But you want to have that all in one place written down, and that makes it easier to use.
Yes. So can you talk through how you talked about your individual use there with being disciplined about writing down the different options? How is it showing up in a group setting? If you're at the table with your leadership team, what's the approach that the group is using to implementing the strategy screen?
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things to think about there. That's a great question. I think that you can do it kind of in 2 ways, which I'll call explicit and implicit.
Okay.
As a quick aside, having been there myself, right, I really want to encourage myself not to phone in coming up with the questions in the first instance. Right. It is pretty easy to come up with a quick list of things that seem important and generate your list of questions for the strategy screen that way. But you really want to put the time in. Don't ChatGPT it, right? It's just as tempting as it may be, and it probably would do a creditable job in the first instance. But don't do that. This is one of these things where you want to put all the electronics down and try and sit with yourself for a while and think if you really had to answer to yourself about what's important in your organization, that's the stuff you want to go in. So once you have that, now to your question, how do you use it with your team? So I think there are 2 ways. I am very much in favor of introducing it to your team explicitly and getting their input in formulating the questions in the first instance, right? So I would have a dedicated team meeting to try and create these questions in a way that involves folks in your team up and down the organization, right? I think it's most useful when it reflects the input and viewpoints of people in lots of different organizational roles and isn't sort of introduced from the forehead of Zeus complete, right?
Couldn't possibly be any better with anyone else's input. Yeah,
exactly.
Want to avoid that.
So that's my own experience. Is it works best when you get people together and they're involved in creating it in the first instance, and then you can, once it's built, then you can make it. I think you talked about literally putting it on your agendas, on your meeting agendas, as a way to sort of keep it top of mind. And I think it makes sense to have meetings where the sole purpose is to go through each question with the team individually, and then take a look at what you have gotten out of it. And it's a process you can repeat. In other words, you can keep like multi-filtered water. You can put it through multiple times, and it's intriguing. I think people, I hope your listeners, if they use it, will be really excited to discover that it does take you in new directions. That's what I like about it. I think everybody, myself included, wants a tool that's easy to deploy, that gives great output, that makes sense for the organization, and is also motivates people, right? That is sort of a renewing thing for the decision making in your organization. And as everybody knows, right? If it's too good to be true, it probably is. So there are lots of sort of quick hit tools out there that promise a lot and don't require very much upfront investment, and they don't always work out.
Yeah.
So the thing that makes this better is if you have done that groundwork in terms of thinking about your own strategic values and plan, then using it explicitly with your team in meetings like this is a great way to link your strategic goals to something practical that you can do. Involve those strategic goals and values in each important decision you make. That's kind of the discipline. So to me, then it acts almost like a kind of an anchor, and keeps you from drifting, right, from slipping out into the bay of sort of half-cooked decision making, and ensures that you're getting those same things in each iteration.
Yeah, I can certainly see that anchor metaphor being a useful one. I know when I was the CEO of a nonprofit, we had an opportunity that on the face of it looked very much aligned with our mission, was focused on sort of financial needs of a vulnerable group. We were already doing a lot of services in that space. But as we dug into it, using a strategy screen, we started to hit some challenges related to internal capacity, in terms of financial sustainability, in terms of this notion of just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. Right. And is there anyone else who could do this? To what degree was there opportunity for collaboration? If collaboration was one of our sort of core ways of organizing our work. And so ultimately concluded, with the help of the strategy screen, we have to say no to this. And I think that's one of the things that can be really liberating for organizations, particularly those in a mission-oriented entity, is there's such a pressure and a temptation to say yes and we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
With the strategy screen, you can say a positive no. We cannot, we will not, and here's the reasons why. And as a team, we had that discussion. We all heard how the filter question played out. And so everyone can be still maybe disappointed about the outcome, but have a really clear understanding of that.
I love that. I think that's so true that at its best, it will surprise you. There are things that seem like they will work, that seem like you want to do, that maybe it will help you disqualify. And the opposite, things that you didn't think would work on kind of a casual first pass, right? But then as you bring the elements and the questions and the screen to them, it can help you develop something that really can work. This is absolutely not my idea, but I love that sort of concept of thinking fast and slow, right? In terms of decision making. And one of the things that resonated with me in that book is the idea that we will often, if we're faced with a really, really hard or difficult question, unconsciously, right? In a way that we are not necessarily aware of, our mind will substitute an easier question. So I'm going to make this up, but if I'm an investment manager, I buy a car manufacturer's stock for my portfolio, not because I've done the due diligence, but because I like the car. And sometimes that works. Sometimes that works out. That's can be a good way to develop investment ideas, but sometimes it doesn't, and it's not necessarily the most rigorous. I'm aware that I do that myself. That that's what your mind wants to do, is find that path of least resistance to a solution. So this will help you sort that out. I want to add one more thing in response to your earlier question about how to use it with your team. It sometimes isn't always practical to haul out the table or what have you and move through each step as an overture to decision making in each meeting, but you can use it behind the scenes in lots of really effective ways. So as you are, for example, building an agenda for an important meeting, you can think about ensuring that you are addressing the important questions in the screen, even if you're not literally reading each question and inviting each member of the group to answer it each time. I think there are occasions when that's really good and you want to do that.
Yes.
And there are others where it isn't practical, but that doesn't mean you have to abandon the screen. I guess that's what I'm saying, is if a decision is so urgent that it doesn't allow for kind of your traditional deployment of the tool, don't give up on involving
Right.
those principles, right, and trust yourself to bring those considerations into the agenda and the discussion. Like any other tool, the more you use it, the better you'll get
Yes.
at using it, and that discipline will serve you very well.
And as you find more and more team members develop some fluency with the questions themselves, their thinking on so many different issues starts to bring in those filters.
Yes.
So an idea is at the individual level being considered from the mission perspective, from the financial perspective, from the human resources perspective. And then when an idea that might be initially kind of a half-baked rough draft idea
Right.
is coming to the group, it's already been massaged a little bit thanks to that individual knowing the questions of strategy screen, sort of anticipating that that's going to come up in conversation. And so they've already designed something that hopefully is going to flow through many of those filter questions from the outset.
I think that's absolutely right.
So when we think about the questions around identity, questions around sort of practical operational considerations, financials, capacity, what's kind of, if an organization is just starting out to use this, where are they going to start? What's like if there are 2 or 3 that every strategy screen, no matter what type of organization you're working with, you want to make sure you have on the list?
Yes, I think so. So, and I would break them up into sort of rough categories, right? I think you want one that speaks to your organizational values. That's really important, that you have one so that you ensure that that is part of every important decision and isn't getting left behind in favor of practical considerations, which can really happen very easily and sort of unintentionally. So you want one on values. I think you want one that is sort of traditionally fiscal. But I will throw a note in here that you want that to be nuanced. This is where we come back to that idea of really investing the time up front to craft a good question that's more than can we afford it, right? That's the baseline one that everybody, right, especially in government, that's the first question anybody, is there budget for this?
And maybe we're not only thinking about one fiscal year.
That's right.
Maybe we're looking a little further out.
Well, I think you just put your finger on it. That's right. And so there's not the time scale is important, but more than just a sort of a naked budget question, I would roll into that fiscal question all kinds of things like, or does this, if we have partners, does this increase their confidence in us, and how? If we have stakeholders that we think are going to react to a given decision, can we fold that into sort of, to me, that second leg of the stool, sort of the traditional business considerations question. So you want all those things baked into that. And then finally, I think you do want an explicit kind of time question. So how long, not just how long do we think this will take, but how does this affect our longer term planning, to your point, right? So we're thinking about the impact of the decision. I'm kind of stuck on the new location, right? So let's think about, let's think about where we're going to be in 5 years with that. And if, for example, there are going to be still more locations, have we thought about how the one we're considering immediately helps out down the line? So I think that's it. Values, fiscal, including things like customer sentiment and things that go beyond sort of the numbers, and then another one that's sort of how does this work in terms of our longer term planning.
Yeah, I think those are really useful categories. If everyone sort of starts there and ensure you have at least one that covers that values, that identity piece, the fiscal piece, and then the time scales and that sort of longer range consequences, you're going to have a building block of a screen that's going to be very useful to you.
Yes.
Thinking of the time as a question that's embedded in the strategy screen itself brings up this notion of the shelf life of the screen as a whole. You know, organizations are constantly facing new opportunities, changes in leadership, the strategy might evolve. So how long would you recommend organizations use the questions that they have in their current strategy screen? And is there some type of process of weeding, updating, refreshing?
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is part of that discipline of making it sort of a habit of mind. So again, we're assuming, or at least I am for this conversation, that the organization has done some basic strategic planning work, so that you have those building blocks to draw on. So then I think you can build a refresh, if you like, a redesign of the screen into your review of your strategic plan. So you probably already have a periodic review of the plan, or at least the plan will expire at some point. So whenever you're getting together to refit the plan, I think that's the moment to include the screen. And that's another thing that I love about the screen as a tool, is that it, to me, is the linkage. It is the transmission between the engine of your strategic plan and the output of your work plans, your day-to-day work plans. That's candidly the thing I like most about it. Is It can be really challenging, and I think folks listening will have had the same experience. It can be challenging to translate your strategic plan into specific action steps for staff that they can take and that they feel like they relate to. The strategy screen accomplishes that.
It does.
It takes those values and transmutes them into practical considerations in your decision making that you can then link to a really, really hyper-specific work plan with steps and a time frame and people who own individual projects. And so it allows everything to kind of cohere in a way that is difficult without it.
Yeah, I agree. So that's really important, is to be able to think, all right, we've developed this, but it's not static. We want it to be dynamic. When we have a review of the progress on our strategy, we'll also take a look at our strategy screen, and maybe we'll adjust some of those questions. And presumably, if the team has been testing them regularly as it's running different opportunities, different threats through the filter questions, they're going to start to see, I feel like we're still missing a question, or maybe this question's not quite capturing it. And let's say you have an example where you ran a new opportunity through the strategy screen, and the group discussed, there was some consensus on most of them, but there was maybe one question where it looked like there was still some lingering hesitation. The group decides to move forward anyway. Let's say that particular case didn't work out the way that everyone thought. What's the sort of after-action discussion there? And how do you prevent something like that from eroding trust in the strategy screen as a tool?
That's such an interesting question, and there's lots there to think about. So we'll try and go through it, piece by piece,
systematically.
That's right. That's right. So I think the first thing that you want to think about is there some kind of latent hierarchy in your screen? In other words, are there questions that are more important than others? Are there sort of deal breaker questions that if the group concludes a given proposition fails, that you will agree beforehand that you will not move forward. So that's a little bit of a tangent to your question, but an important one. And I remember you're talking to me actually about one of the benefits of the screen being that you get that sort of buy-in and consensus around the screen, and then it can head off, frankly, unproductive conflict in a meeting because you have already agreed to the sort of the ground rules, to the terms that inform the screen, and you save yourself maybe a lot of time and consternation that way. So I think that's an important tangent to your question. In terms of having something where the group has decided to press on despite there being some red lights on the board of the strategy screen, then there are a couple of different things. I think if you do that and then the project fails in a straightforward way that is kind of irresistible, then I think you do. Again, I'm a big fan of the dedicated meeting with an agenda. to figure that out, right? Physicians, for example, if something goes wrong in a medical procedure, have a kind of a group meeting where they get together and it's understood that it isn't to assign blame. There won't be any sort of recrimination. In fact, we really want, as a policy matter, to protect that space for them to sort of figure out what happened.
Yeah, prevent it from happening again.
That's right. And so I think you can do the same thing here, but it's really important that it not tip over into blame.
Yep.
So in the first instance, you want to have an after action. You want to build a habit of having those meetings, but you want to ensure that you're protecting the people in them, and that it's understood that it's not, the purpose isn't to assign blame or to think about who individually might have caused the organization to be where it is, but to think about how you can do better in the future. So I think in that meeting, you want to figure out sort of what went wrong. Did we not apply something that we meant to? Did we apply it, but we didn't do it successfully? In other words, we thought we were addressing, is this something that would create better conditions for staff, that something that would be helpful to the organization, and we just didn't do the analysis correctly? Or is it the case that we failed on a deal breaker term, but for some reason we didn't recognize that in the discussion? I feel strongly that if you put the right things, whatever your organization does, if you take the time to invest in the screen, it will give you reliably successful outputs, so that if something does go wrong, then it'll make that after action easier. The more you have invested in the questions up front, the easier it's going to be to do the after action and figure out again whether you bypassed a consideration that would have helped, or whether the analysis was just flawed in some way.
Right. Yeah, and I think that notion of having comfort with the team, of being able to discuss failure in ways that do not assign blame, but allow for learning, sort of in the spirit of growth mindset, right? That is going to be something that really helps the organization tackle so many different challenges, not just your big strategic questions. So
that's really true.
Fostering that sort of open culture is going to be really largely beneficial. I want to switch gears and play with this notion of strategy screen, and apply it more to our individual decision making. But first, I do want to let people know, if they're really interested in seeing a sample strategy screen, we will link to that on the show notes on the Behaviorist website. Also would recommend the book, The Nonprofit Strategy Revolution by David LaPiana. It's a lot of great examples about how to use a strategy screen if people want to learn more. So thinking about how useful this tool can be for organizational decision making, this notion of discipline, this notion of a habit of mind, wouldn't it be equally or perhaps even more beneficial if we did it as individuals, right? We're always confronting, as we go through life's milestones, forks in the road of various kind. And what if there was some set of questions that could help us, if we ask them consistently, sort of stay true to who we are, right? That identity piece. Think through the risk factors, particularly the financial ones, and ultimately think about, like, who do I want to be? What do I want to achieve in my life? Get closer to those sort of long-term big goals that we might have. So what do you think that could look like? How could we translate this concept?
So a couple of things. It's a wonderful question and a really exciting question. And so I think my answer is an emphatic yes, that you can use this tool in your personal life, absolutely, and that it can be really beneficial to do it, and that it actually will help you at work if you're using it to do that, and I'll tell you why, or at least I'll theorize as to why, right? I think if you're somebody, and it's clear that I'm sort of an unabashed super nerd, right, where this stuff is concerned. If you're someone who likes thinking about decision-making in organizations and process and kind of the philosophy of organizational decision-making, I think you can sometimes, I'll just speak for myself, I sometimes feel caught a little bit between when that isn't happening in my own life, right? Where and then I think you can feel like, well, this is how do I import some of that, rigor into my own decision making, and it frankly it helps the decision process thinking that you're doing at work also not to feel artificial. I think that can happen too, where the tools that you leave at work can sort of inadvertently be devalued, right? Because they aren't things that are present at home.
Right.
So I think absolutely you can use it, and that you can run kind of a similar process. Now, I think the big kind of it's not really a disclaimer, but the first big barrier is just like your organization has to have, I think, a strategic plan as a prerequisite for having a useful or successful strategy screen. I have to have some sense of where I'm going to build a screen that will be useful to me in my own life. So I think that if we think a little bit about our own long-term goals, then we can build the same kind of three-bucket approach to building a strategy screen that works for us, right? What are the things? What are the deal breakers for me? The things that go to my own values that I won't negotiate or compromise, that I simply will agree with myself and my family I won't do, regardless of the other benefits or allurements, right?
Right.
So that's one bucket. The second is kind of the traditional financial and resource limitation question, and the third is still time, right? So I think you can apply this to all sorts of big decisions, right? Like, are we going to move?
Right.
And in retrospect, I wish I had a methodology for thinking about some of these things in my own life. Going backwards, right? So, am I going to move? Am I going to go to graduate school? Am I going to take a different job? What schools am I going to help my kids pick? These are all things that it's really easy. I guess that's what I want to say the most to folks is, this tool, like so many others in organizational thinking, can be super effective if it guides you into the kind of planning that will be helpful to you and your family, right? So you have to connect it to those values and that thinking that you're doing in your own personal life, and then it will not seem frivolous, right? Which it can. That's the problem, I think, as a quick aside, as you know, and I bet some of your listeners will too. Part of the difficulty, if you're somebody who is interested in these things in a leadership position in any organization, in selling them, so to speak, to other folks in your organization, is overcoming that sense that it's not practical.
Right.
That it's kind of,
more thing.
frippery. Like, who has time? This doesn't. First of all, these are all kind of manufacturing ideas that don't apply to me or my business or what I'm doing, and also I'm just too busy to run through what seems to me to be this kind of arbitrary list of questions unrelated to my job. So I think that how you overcome that is by, as we talked about before, involving people in creating them, but then being really, really thoughtful about highlighting the successes that you have using it, and showing to the folks you work with, sticking with the work context for a second, how it helps them, right? How it has made their own work easier, or allowed you or them to do things together that you would not be able to do otherwise. So I think the same thing applies in your personal life, whether it's just you yourself or whether you're trying to sort of build this kind of practice in your family decision making. Taking the time to apply it together is what, to me, makes the difference between failure and success. Is if you leave it up on the shelf with a spotlight on it, right?
But never use it,
or use it without bringing others along with you to sort of see how it works. Then I think it's really easy for and this is, folks can have all kinds of, I think, really valid different views of it, but it's so good, it's so effective that it will hide its success, if that makes sense, and it will produce outputs that seem like they came from kind of from nowhere, that that were the the product of a much less formal, less rigorous process of thought, and that's not really true. There are a lot of cases where the successes really were you draw a straight line from the screen or the tool to the output, but that won't always be visible to everybody. So you want to take the time to do that, and that works in your personal life too.
That's great. The same thing as we discussed with the organizational strategy. Let's say you develop a series of filter questions for making these big decisions, either you individually or you with other members of your household. How often do you want to look at those again and say, hey, are these still working for us? Are these still serving? I love what you said about, hey, let's identify when we had successes using this. Likewise, the whole blameless postmortem concept, let's also think about maybe where it didn't serve us, and that's okay too. And what can we learn from that?
Well, that's really true. And this is maybe, speaking of it producing unexpected results, you can use it too, I think, as a kind of a straw man. Now, this risks going way afield, but in terms of thinking about how to have a frictionless process of decision making in one's own life. Using a tool like the screen explicitly and building that in will help avoid conflict too, right? Because just as you say, and I really love that thought you had about, well, we've agreed in advance to the terms of the screen, so those are kind of no longer open for debate, right? We've resolved those threshold questions. And I'll just speak for myself. It's those threshold questions that can creep back in, right? When you're trying to figure out what happened with a given decision. Boy, does it rapidly leave sometimes the events of the particular decision, right, and come back to much bigger things.
Yes. Another thing.
That's right. Remember what that time? That's right. And those often go, don't they, to the first principles, to the things that go into making the screen in the first instance. So while that is not always going to be successful, and it is not a soccer-like colored card that we can hold up to end a fight or avoid one, it does go some way to a more productive communication to think about those things explicitly together with whoever is important in your life in making those decisions. In terms of how often to review it, I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility there. But I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting application of it, because your needs for it are going to change as you get older. If you have kids, as they get older, so I think there are going to be waypoints, kind of natural waypoints to build some reflection
for different seasons.
Exactly,
of life.
Right. Like I'll just give you a personal example. It's our oldest son is in a really wonderful school, and so if I was going to sketch one out, right, one of our screen questions for anything big, like we're not thinking about this, but if we were thinking about moving, would be, okay, is this something where he could stay in the school that he's in, or how would this affect his his education? Well, that's a question that's going to change as he gets older and we get older. So I think, again, it's not a panacea. It's not as though having one of these is going to fix problems on its own. Right. But I am very, very adamant that being rigorous, taking the time to think about how we think, really, really, really will pay dividends. So I think that's a good way. Any tool is better than no tool. Yep. This tool is especially good among tools, and applied even to our personal decisions will really, really help.
Ah, that was a perfect note to end on. Thank you, Clarke. I'm so glad that you were part of this conversation, how you have adopted the tool with fidelity, with enthusiasm, helped bring it to your team. Certainly through the strategic planning process, you were such a champion for hearing the voices of your whole team. And now we're seeing the fruit of this tool being deployed with your team, and love the connection of how we could use it internally in our own personal lives as well. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you to our listeners for downloading The Behaviorists. We hope you'll subscribe. You can reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com. You can find Work Wisdom Press, productions, ask us questions, and we love to hear suggestions of topics you want us to explore in the future. And as is our custom, we'll leave you with a quote. This one comes from one of my favorite series. I'm guessing it might be one of yours too, Clarke.
Sure.
And this is the Lord of the Rings series by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is Gandalf saying, "It is wisdom to recognize necessity when all other courses have been weighed, though as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope."